Judge Judy had watched countless defendants walk into her courtroom wearing confidence like armor. She had seen polished smiles, expensive suits, and rehearsed excuses. But on that unforgettable morning, the entire room fell silent when Karen Whitmore leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and smirked before saying, "You can't touch me." The words echoed through the courtroom with a confidence that seemed almost unnatural. Even the bailiff glanced toward Judge Judy, expecting an immediate response. But none came. Judge Judy didn't move. She simply looked at Karen for a few long seconds. That silence unsettled everyone except Karen herself. She mistook it for hesitation. She had no idea it was calculation. Pay close attention to what happened next, because that single moment transformed what appeared to be an ordinary civil dispute into one of the most unforgettable courtroom confrontations anyone in that gallery would ever witness. Sitting quietly across the room was an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis. Her hands rested on an old leather folder whose edges had worn soft with age. She never looked at Karen. Instead, her fingers remained wrapped around the folder as though it contained the last piece of a life no one else understood. No one knew why Judge Judy kept glancing toward that folder. Not yet. And Karen certainly didn't. Before this story goes any deeper, make sure you're subscribed for more unforgettable courtroom stories. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this case is about to take a turn no one inside that courtroom expected. Karen looked perfectly comfortable. Her designer jacket was immaculate. Her posture was relaxed. Every movement suggested she believed she was only minutes away from walking out victorious. She even smiled at the gallery. Experienced judges learn something that most people never notice. Innocent people usually focus on explaining. People hiding the truth often will focus on controlling the room. Karen wasn't watching Judge Judy. She was watching everyone else's reactions. That small difference mattered. Judge Judy noticed it immediately. Buddies confess before mouths do. Margaret, meanwhile, sat almost perfectly still. She wasn't rehearsing answers. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She looked like someone carrying a burden for far longer than anyone should. The courtroom clerk announced the case, a dispute over property restoration and unpaid damages. Civil, at least. That's what everyone believed from the paperwork. Karen certainly acted as though the case was beneath her. She let out a quiet laugh. "This should only take 5 minutes," she whispered loudly enough for Margaret to hear. Margaret lowered her eyes but said nothing. Judge Judy noticed that too. Real fear does not always shake. Sometimes it sits perfectly still. The judge finally leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said calmly, "you seem unusually confident." Karen smiled again. "Because I've done absolutely nothing wrong." Her answer arrived too quickly, too polished, too practiced. The courtroom couldn't feel it yet. But Judge Judy already had. Confidence without caution often hides something far more dangerous than panic. As the opening statements began, Karen painted Margaret as an elderly woman who had become confused, emotional, and unable to remember basic facts. She insisted Margaret was inventing problems simply because she regretted selling part of her family's historic property months earlier. Every sentence sounded prepared. Every accusation chipped away at Margaret's credibility rather than addressing the evidence. When someone cannot defeat the facts, they often attack the person carrying them. Judge Judy never interrupted. She simply listened, occasionally making one small note, occasionally glancing back toward that weathered leather folder resting beneath Margaret's trembling hands. The gallery began leaning toward Karen's version of events. After all, she sounded convincing. Professional, organized. Margaret had barely spoken 10 words. But appearances inside a courtroom have fooled many people before, never Judge Judy. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret slowly opened the old folder. She didn't remove photographs. She didn't pull out contracts. Instead, she carefully placed one small brass key onto the evidence table. It looked old, scratched, almost worthless. Karen saw it, and for the very first time since entering the courtroom. Her smile disappeared. Judge Judy noticed the change instantly. She didn't ask about the key. Not yet, because timing matters in a courtroom. And whatever that tiny object meant, it had just cracked the confidence of a woman who moments earlier believed she was untouchable. The next question Judge Judy asked would determine whether Karen's smirk had been confidence, or the beginning of her downfall. The tiny brass key sat alone on the evidence table. Yet somehow it had become the heaviest object in the courtroom. Judge Judy did not touch it. She simply watched Karen. That was all she needed. People who are telling the truth usually look at the evidence. People hiding something often look at the person presenting it. Karen never looked at the key again. Instead, she locked her eyes on Margaret Ellis, hoping intimidation would accomplish what facts could not. Judge Judy noticed the shift immediately. The courtroom has a pulse, she often believed, and that morning everyone could feel it change. To understand why that worn brass key mattered, you first have to understand the woman who carried it. Margaret Ellis was 73 years old. She'd spent nearly 4 decades running a small family-owned bed and breakfast that overlooked a quiet lake outside Cedar Falls. It wasn't famous, it wasn't luxurious. But every floorboard, every window frame, and every brick carried memories of birthdays, anniversaries, and family gatherings that had filled the old house with life. When her husband Daniel passed away after a long illness, Margaret found herself caring for the property alone. Money became tight, maintenance became harder every year. She eventually accepted an offer from Karen Whitmore, a successful local property investor who promised to restore part of the historic estate while allowing Margaret to remain in the original home for the rest of her life. On paper, it looked like kindness. In reality, it would become something far different. This case was never really about money, the narrator explained. It was about trust wearing the disguise of a business agreement. Margaret wasn't an inexperienced woman. She had balanced budgets, raised children, managed employees, survived loss. She wasn't confused. She was exhausted. There is a difference, and Judge Judy recognized it immediately. Karen's attorney described Margaret as emotional and forgetful. He argued that she misunderstood the renovation contract and was now blaming Karen because construction hadn't gone the way she imagined. The explanation sounded polished, perhaps even reasonable. But something about Margaret didn't match the story being told about her. Judge Judy looked toward the old folder resting beside her. Inside were neatly organized receipts tied together with faded blue ribbon URD bills dating back years, handwritten maintenance logs, letters exchanged with contractors. Every page was dated. Every note carefully labeled. Confused people rarely preserve years of evidence with that kind of precision. Margaret had prepared quietly because she believed truth deserved organization. Judge Judy appreciated people like that. She asked only one question. "Mrs. Ellis, why did you keep every document?" Margaret hesitated for a moment before answering. "My husband always told me, paper remembers what people choose to forget." No one spoke. Even Karen's attorney lowered his eyes. Sometimes a single sentence tells the court more than an hour of testimony. Judge Judy wrote something on her legal pad. Karen shifted slightly in her chair. It was the first movement she'd made that wasn't completely controlled. The narrator continued. Experienced judges learn that genuine pain usually appears in small details. Not loud crying, not dramatic speeches. Small details. Margaret's wedding ring still rested on her finger. Though worn thin by decades of use, she absent-mindedly turned it whenever she spoke about Daniel. She never realized she was doing it. Judge Judy noticed. Baity language often reveals memories words cannot reach. Margaret carefully removed an old photograph from the folder. It showed her husband standing proudly beside the front entrance of their home nearly 20 years earlier. The same brass key now resting on the evidence table, hung from Daniel's keychain in the picture. Judge Judy studied both the photograph and the key. Karen suddenly crossed her arms tighter. Her breathing became noticeably slower, not relaxed, controlled. People trying to stay calm often breathe differently than people who are calm. Karen still wore the same confident expression, but it no longer reached her eyes. Judge Judy had seen that look before. It was the expression of someone calculating which version of the truth would survive the next question. The judge finally leaned forward. "So this key belonged to your husband?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And why bring it here today?" Margaret looked directly at Judge Judy for the first time. "Because that key opened something Karen insisted never existed." The courtroom froze. Karen's attorney immediately objected. "Speculation." Judge Judy calmly raised one hand. "I'll decide what's speculation." Silence returned. Karen swallowed, barely noticeable. But Judge Judy noticed. Liars often rehearse answers. They forget to rehearse surprise. No one in the courtroom yet understood what the key unlocked. No one except Margaret. And perhaps Judge Judy Karen still believed she could explain everything away. She still believed documents could be challenged, memories questioned, witnesses discredited. But she had completely underestimated one thing. Margaret hadn't come to court carrying revenge. She had come carrying proof. And somewhere beyond that locked door waited the first piece of evidence capable of destroying everything Karen had spent months building. The courtroom doors had barely finished closing when Karen Whitmore settled back into her chair as though she owned the room. She adjusted the cuff of her tailored jacket with slow precision, offered a confident smile to her attorney, and glanced toward Margaret with the unmistakable expression of someone convinced the outcome had already been decided. Judge Judy watched every movement. She had presided over thousands of disputes, and experience had taught her one simple truth. People rarely reveal themselves while speaking. They reveal themselves while waiting. Karen wasn't waiting for justice. She was waiting for permission to declare herself the winner. To everyone outside the courtroom, Karen had built an impressive reputation. She owned several renovation companies. She appeared at charity fundraisers. Her face had appeared in local business magazines celebrating her as a woman who preserved historic homes instead of tearing them down. Neighbors admired her. Investors trusted her. Community leaders praised her. It was the perfect image. But appearances are often the easiest thing to purchase. Character is far more expensive. According to Margaret, Karen had approached her almost 2 years earlier with warmth, patience, and promises. She complimented the history of the Ellis family property. She spoke about honoring Daniel's legacy. She promised every renovation would preserve the home's original character. She even attended Daniel's memorial service. Looking back, Margaret admitted that kindness had been the easiest thing to believe because she desperately wanted someone to care about the house as much as she did. That was Karen's greatest talent. She understood exactly what people needed to hear. Manipulators rarely begin with threats. They begin with comfort. Judge Judy quietly folded her hands. She wasn't listening only to Karen's words. She was studying how those words landed. Karen finally stood to present her version of events. "My company fulfilled every obligation under the agreement," she said confidently. "Mrs. Ellis simply refuses to accept that change is part of restoring old properties." Her voice never cracked. Her posture remained perfect. She sounded rehearsed. Then she looked directly at Margaret. "Honestly, Your Honor, she's remembering a version of events that never happened." Margaret said nothing. Karen continued. "She's grieving. I understand that. Losing a spouse is difficult, but grief affects memory." The courtroom shifted uneasily. That wasn't evidence, that was strategy. When someone cannot defeat the facts, they often attempt to weaken the person presenting them. Judge Judy leaned forward. "So your position is that Mrs. Ellis is simply mistaken?" Karen nodded immediately. "Exactly. You don't believe she intentionally lied?" Karen smiled. "No, I think she's confused." There it was, not an accusation. A dismissal. A carefully chosen word designed to make every future statement Margaret offered seem unreliable. Judge Judy made another note: bodies confess before mouths do. Karen smiled every time she questioned Margaret's memory, but she stopped smiling whenever anyone mentioned the brass key. That inconsistency interested Judge Judy far more than the testimony itself. The narrator paused. Pay attention to confidence that comes with conditions. Real confidence survives every subject. False confidence disappears the moment the wrong subject enters the conversation. Judge Judy looked toward the evidence table. The key seems to make you uncomfortable, Miss Whitmore. Karen laughed. A rusty old key? Hardly. The laugh came a fraction too quickly. Her attorney shifted in his seat. He hadn't expected the question. Neither had Karen. I've renovated dozens of homes, Karen continued. Owners collect old junk all the time. Sentimental objects don't change contracts. Judge Judy remained expressionless, perhaps. She let the silence linger. Silence often pressures people more effectively than confrontation. Karen couldn't tolerate it. She spoke again before anyone asked another question. I don't even know what that key opens. Judge Judy looked up from her notes. I didn't ask whether you knew. The room fell completely still. Karen blinked. For the first time that morning, she realized she had answered a question no one had asked. Experienced judges recognize moments like that instantly. People protecting the truth answer questions. People protecting lies answer fears. Karen had revealed exactly what she feared, the key. Her attorney leaned toward her and whispered something urgently. Karen's confident posture stiffened. Across the courtroom, Margaret quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not in relief, not in triumph, simply in hope that someone was finally seeing what she had been trying to explain for months. Judge Judy turned another page in the case file. She hadn't reached for the leather folder beneath her bench yet. She hadn't asked about the photograph. She hadn't mentioned the maintenance records. And she certainly hadn't asked about the locked room. Margaret claimed still existed inside the property. Timing mattered. The strongest evidence is never the first evidence. Judge Judy finally looked directly at Karen. Her voice remained calm. Mrs. Whitmore. Karen straightened her shoulders. When was the last time you personally entered the east wing of Mrs. Ellis's property? Karen's confidence returned instantly. Never. The answer came without hesitation, without caution, without thought. Judge Judy slowly opened a thin envelope that had remained untouched since the hearing began. Inside was a single document. She studied it for several seconds before looking back at Karen. The judge didn't smile. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked one quiet sentence that caused Karen's attorney to close his eyes before Karen could even answer. Then how do you explain your signature on the access log for the locked east wing, dated 3 weeks after you claimed it had been permanently sealed? Karen's smile vanished. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her, and for the first time since she had smirked and declared, "You can't touch me," Karen had no prepared answer. Karen didn't answer. For nearly 5 full seconds, the courtroom existed in absolute silence. It wasn't the kind of silence created by confusion. It was the kind that appears when a carefully rehearsed story suddenly collides with a fact no one expected. Judge Judy never looked away. She simply held the access log in one hand while watching Karen's face instead of the paper. Experienced judges know that evidence tells one story, reactions often tell another. Karen swallowed. Her attorney leaned closer. "Take your time," he whispered. That advice came too late. Judge Judy had already seen the first crack. Real confidence doesn't need coaching. Karen forced a smile. There must be some mistake. Judge Judy tilted her head ever so slightly. A mistake? Someone from my company probably signed it. You just testified that you had never entered the East Wing. I haven't. Judge Judy calmly slid the document across the bench. The signature doesn't belong to an employee. Karen remained silent. It belongs to you. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. The bailiff shifted his weight. Even the court reporter briefly looked up before continuing to type. The narrator spoke softly. Liars often prepare for difficult questions. They rarely prepare for their own signatures. Karen tried another approach. I sign hundreds of documents every week. Judge Judy nodded. I believe you. Karen looked relieved, then Judge Judy continued. Which is exactly why I find it interesting that you remember every contract except the one connected to a locked room. Karen's relief vanished. She looked toward her attorney. He no longer nodded. He no longer smiled. Instead, he quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. He understood what Karen did not. The courtroom wasn't arguing about paperwork anymore. It was measuring credibility. Judge Judy folded her hands. Miss Whitmore. Yes, earlier you described the brass key as old junk. Karen nodded cautiously. Yes, so if it was meaningless, Judge Judy paused. Why did you change the locks? Karen froze. The question landed harder than anyone expected. Margaret looked down. She already knew the answer. Karen didn't. At least not one she could safely say aloud. The narrator broke the silence. Bodies confess before mouths do. Karen's fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand. Her shoulders became rigid. Her breathing shortened. The smile that had greeted the courtroom less than an hour earlier had completely disappeared. Judge Judy didn't interrupt. She allowed the pressure to build naturally. People reveal remarkable things when they believe silence is their enemy. Karen finally spoke. The property needed security upgrades. Judge Judy asked calmly. So every lock on the property was replaced? Yes. Every single one? Yes. Judge Judy made another note. No exceptions? Karen answered too quickly. No. Margaret quietly closed her eyes. Judge Judy noticed hope behaves differently than victory. Hope stays quiet. Then Margaret slowly reached back into the worn leather folder. She carefully removed another item, not a contract, not another photograph, a small envelope. Its edges had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 5 simple words: East Wing. Original lock records. Karen's face lost what little color remained. The courtroom felt it immediately. Judge Judy had not opened the envelope. She hadn't even touched it. She simply looked at Karen. Then she looked at the juryless gallery. Finally, she returned her attention to the defendant. Interesting. That was all she said, just one word. Sometimes the quietest observation carries the greatest weight. Karen suddenly spoke over the judge. Those records don't prove anything. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. I haven't said they do. Karen realized her mistake the instant the words left her mouth. She had challenged evidence before anyone knew what it contained. Fear had answered first. Laddick never had the chance. If you can already feel where this is going, comment *justice below. Because what Judge Judy was about to reveal changed the entire courtroom. Judge Judy slowly reached for the envelope. She handled it with extraordinary care, as though she already understood its importance. Then she turned toward Margaret. Mrs. Ellis, Margaret nodded quietly. Is this the envelope your husband asked you never to open unless someone claimed that room never existed? A tear formed in Margaret's eye. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Judy broke the seal. Inside wasn't just one document. There were several: a folded floor plan, a handwritten letter, and one small flash drive secured inside a clear evidence sleeve. Karen's attorney closed his briefcase, not because the hearing was over, because he suddenly realized it was about to become something entirely different. Judge Judy picked up the flash drive and held it between her fingers. She looked directly at the courtroom monitor. Then she delivered 7 calm words that made Karen's confidence collapse completely. Bailiff, let's see what's stored on this. Karen's chair scraped loudly against the courtroom floor as she stood halfway up. Your Honor, I object. Judge Judy didn't even look at her. She simply handed the flash drive to the bailiff. Within moments, the courtroom screen flickered to life, and whatever was waiting on that tiny device had been hidden long enough. The courtroom monitor flickered once, then again. No one spoke, Even the faint tapping of the court reporter's keyboard had stopped. Judge Judy never rushed moments like this. She understood something that years on the bench had taught her. Truth arrives most powerfully when it is allowed to speak for itself. The screen faded from black to grainy security footage. A timestamp appeared in the lower corner, 3 weeks after Karen had claimed the East Wing had been permanently sealed. The video showed the hallway outside the locked room. Nothing happened for several seconds. Karen stared at the monitor without blinking. Her attorney slowly lowered his head. He already suspected what was coming. Then a woman entered the frame. She wore a construction helmet, a reflective safety vest, and carried a ring of keys. The courtroom leaned forward. The woman stopped in front of the East Wing door. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a brass key, the very same brass key now resting on the evidence table. She unlocked the door. Before stepping inside, she removed her helmet. The courtroom gasped. It was Karen. No one had to identify her. The video did it for them. Karen herself had unlocked the room she had sworn she had never entered. Judge Judy never celebrated. She simply watched Karen instead of the screen. People often reveal more during exposure than during accusation. Karen's confidence collapsed in real time. Her shoulders sagged. Her breathing became uneven. She no longer looked like the composed businesswoman who had entered the courtroom with a smirk. She looked like someone desperately searching for a version of events that no longer existed. The narrator spoke quietly. The first proof created doubt. The access log created tension. This video changed the entire case. But the footage wasn't finished. Karen disappeared inside the room. Almost 15 minutes passed. Then she emerged carrying a narrow wooden box. She looked both ways down the hallway. She locked the door again and walked away carrying the box. Judge Judy paused the video. "What was inside the box, Ms. Whitmore?" Karen remained silent. Her attorney whispered, "Answer the question." Karen finally spoke. I don't remember." Judge Judy looked directly at her. "Interesting. You remembered enough to deny entering the room." Karen swallowed. "But suddenly your memory disappears when the box appears." Silence returned. Liars often rehearse words. They forget to rehearse consistency. Judge Judy nodded toward Margaret. "Mrs. Ellis." Margaret carefully opened the handwritten letter that had been inside the envelope. The paper was fragile. Its ink had faded, but every word remained readable. "It was written by my husband 6 months before he passed away." Judge Judy gestured for her to continue. Margaret's voice trembled, not from fear, but from memory. "If anyone ever tells you the East Wing holds nothing of value, they are lying. Inside that room are the original restoration records, every family deed, every financial ledger, and every photograph documenting this property's protected historical status. If those records disappear, so does the truth." The gallery fell completely silent. Judge Judy slowly looked back toward Karen. So the room wasn't empty. Karen said nothing. The key wasn't worthless. Still nothing. And your visit wasn't accidental. Karen lowered her eyes. For the first time since the hearing began, she could no longer meet Judge Judy's gaze. The bailiff placed another item on the evidence table. It was the narrow wooden box recovered during a court-ordered inspection after Margaret filed her complaint. Judge Judy opened it. Inside were dozens of original documents, historic property surveys, signed ownership records, insurance appraisals, family correspondence dating back nearly 70 years. At the very bottom lay one document folded separately from the rest. Judge Judy unfolded it carefully. It was an unsigned redevelopment proposal. Karen's company planned to demolish the protected East Wing and replace it with luxury rental units. The problem? The historic records inside the room legally prevented that project. If those records disappeared, the legal protections disappeared with them. The simple property dispute was never really about unpaid repairs. It was about erasing history for profit. Judge Judy looked directly at Karen. "You weren't preserving this property," she paused. "You were trying to erase the evidence that protected it." Karen's attorney slowly stood. Your Honor! Judge Judy raised one hand. He sat back down. There was nothing left to argue. The courtroom understood it now. Margaret had never been fighting for a building. She had been protecting her husband's legacy. The brass key wasn't just a key. It had become the symbol of memory refusing to surrender to greed. Karen covered her face with trembling hands. The arrogance that had filled the courtroom that morning had vanished completely. All that remained was someone confronted by undeniable truth. Judge Judy closed the final document and placed it gently on the bench. Then she looked toward both parties. Her expression never changed. The court has heard enough. The gallery held its breath. Everyone knew the next words would decide not only the case, but Karen Whitmore's future. Judge Judy closed the final document with deliberate care. The sound of the folder shutting echoed through the silent courtroom. Karen Whitmore sat motionless. Hours earlier, she had entered with a smirk and a challenge. You can't touch me. Now she couldn't even bring herself to look up. Judge Judy folded her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm. The courtroom leaned in. Miss Whitmore, this case began as a dispute over property repairs. She paused. It became something far more serious the moment you chose deception over honesty. Karen opened her mouth as if to respond. Judge Judy raised one finger. No. The single word stopped Karen immediately. You knowingly entered a secured portion of the property after representing that you never had access to it. You removed documents that established the historical protections attached to that property. Then you attempted to convince this court that Mrs. Ellis was simply confused. Judge Judy looked toward Margaret. The evidence proves otherwise. Karen's attorney slowly stood. Your Honor, my client wishes to clarify. Judge Judy interrupted. I've heard enough clarification. What this court needed was truth. The courtroom remained perfectly still. Judge Judy looked directly at Karen. Then she delivered the sentence that everyone would remember long after the hearing ended. When someone hides the truth to steal a future, every lie becomes another piece of evidence. No one spoke. Karen lowered her head. The confidence that had carried her into the courtroom had disappeared completely. Judge Judy continued. This court enters judgment in favor of Mrs. Margaret Ellis. She reviewed the financial documents one final time. Mrs. Ellis is awarded full compensatory damages for the documented losses, reimbursement of legal costs, and immediate return of every document and historical record removed from the property. She closed the file. In addition, this court recommends that today's evidence be forwarded to the appropriate local authorities for review of any potential civil or criminal violations involving protected historical records. Karen's attorney quietly closed his notebook. He offered no objection. There wasn't one left to make. The narrator spoke softly. The verdict wasn't simply about money. It was about restoring something far more valuable: dignity. Margaret remained seated. For several moments she didn't move. She simply looked at the old brass key resting on the evidence table. Judge Judy noticed. Mrs. Ellis. Margaret looked up. I believe that belongs back in your hands. The bailiff carefully picked up the worn brass key and walked it across the courtroom. Margaret accepted it with trembling fingers. She didn't cry because she had won. She cried because someone had finally believed her. The gallery quietly applauded before Judge Judy reminded everyone that decorum still mattered. Even then, the smiles remained. Karen slowly gathered her belongings. No one looked at her the way they had when she entered. Power had left the room long before she did, within 24 hours. The local Historical Preservation Board announced that it would review every renovation project Karen's company had completed on protected properties within 48 hours. Several former clients contacted investigators with concerns of their own. Within 72 hours, Karen's carefully crafted public image had begun to unravel. Not because of rumors, but because the evidence invited questions that could no longer be ignored. Margaret returned home later that week. She unlocked the East Wing herself. Sunlight poured through dusty windows that hadn't been opened in months. She placed Daniel's photograph back where it had always belonged. Then she carefully hung the brass key on the same hook where it had rested for decades. The house felt different, not because it had changed, because the truth had finally returned. The narrator offered one final reflection. Sometimes justice isn't measured by the size of a verdict. Sometimes it's measured by one honest person refusing to surrender the memories that others tried to erase. The old brass key became more than evidence. It became proof that history survives when ordinary people have the courage to protect it. Truth does not always arrive with raised voices or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly, resting inside an old leather folder waiting for the right judge to recognize its value. If this story reminded you that truth and integrity still matter, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful courtroom stories, and share it with someone who believes justice is worth fighting for. And tell us in the comments, at what moment did you realize Karen's confidence was about to collapse?